In the first half of the BCE millennium, many peoples inhabit the lands of modern-day Iran. The indigenous Elamites are huddled in dwellings near the northeastern Persian Gulf and are surrounded by two groups with a common ancestry: the Medes to their northwest and the nomadic Persians, who have settled the regions lower along the eastern side of the Persian Gulf and its southern regions. Events are in motion that will give rise to the largest empire the world had yet been witness to. A king by the name of Cambyses rules over the city-state of Anshan in the old Elam Empire lands adjoining the northeast of the present Persian Gulf. Anshan is a vassal city to the Median Empire that stretches from the area north and east of the Persian Gulf into modern-day Turkey. Cambyses' son, Kyros, or Cyrus, inherited the throne in 551 BCE during the last decade of his father's life. Where his father was content to play the role of subjugated ruler, Cyrus looked to the lands of the Median Empire and beyond with, for now, staid ambition. For now, as his fathers had done before him, he would need to acknowledge the Median overlordship. Upon his father's death, however, Cyrus would begin to act upon that ambition, but the ultimate irony is that the foundation for his empire would be initiated by his enemy's aggression, not his. Ruling the Median Empire was Astyages, a warrior king whose name translated to lance hurler. According to the Nabonidus Chronicles, Astyages launches an attack against Cyrus. He tasks Harpagus, his top general, with leading this attack. However, Harpagus turns double agent and notifies Cyrus of the plan, encouraging him to revolt against Media, and then defects, taking with him several other members of the Median nobility and a large portion of his army. The resulting hostilities and conflict last a full 3 years until the final battle in 550 BCE, which results in the capture of Ecbatana. Cyrus now rules over the Median lands and its vassal states, one of which was ruled by an uncle of his named Artemis, who offers up his throne. However, he would still have a role to play in the leadership of the Achaemenid Empire through his grandson, who would later become Darius the Great. The Lydian king Croesus attacks the Achaemenid city of Pteria in Cappadocia and enslaves its inhabitants. The Persians offer the citizens of Ionia in another part of the Lydian kingdom a chance to revolt against their ruler, but they refuse this gesture. Cyrus then assembles his army and meets Croesus' forces at the mountain town Pteria, which straddles the border river Halys. Croesus fields a smaller army than that of Cyrus, and despite both sides taking almost equal heavy losses, Croesus makes the decision to retreat back over the river Halys. This pushes the front line firmly into his Lydian territory, with Croesus on the defensive and Cyrus in pursuit. On the flanks of both the Lydian and Persian armies are cavalry. They are placed in front of the chariots. Croesus is utilizing his specialized Egyptian phalanx troops. An unnamed Persian officer noted to Cyrus in the leadership that the Lydian horses lacked familiarity with camels, and that it might be possible to panic them at the scent of the animals. Cyrus gave his permission to maneuver some camels from the baggage train in behind the Persian cavalry on their left flank. The Lydian army advances, with its cavalry advancing faster than its slower-moving phalanx at the center of the advance. Cyrus noted the longer line and numerical advantage of Croesus, and that he risked getting outflanked. To counter this, he ordered his center forward and lagged the flanks slightly behind in a refused flank formation. These flanks were formed from his best troops. Croesus, seeing his wings advancing faster than the infantry, calls for them to halt their advance somewhat. However, Dust in the plains, kicked up by both sides' cavalry, has obscured the advancing Persians, and Croesus is unable to see Cyrus holding back his wings, and as a result, he perceives a much smaller box formation, which he hopes to get on to the rear of and encircle. In their haste to charge towards the rear of the Persians, Croesus's cavalry and chariots are then surprised by Cyrus's wings, which now spread out and toward the Lydians. The Persian archers also begin their barrage from both ground and within their fortified battlefield mobile archery towers. Abradatus, the Persian general in charge of the chariots and their deadly scythed wheels, is able to rout the Lydian chariots, but is eventually brought down by the Egyptian spearmen. However, they have managed through this charge to keep the Egyptians out of the fray of the main battle for considerable time. The Lydian horses are, as planned, thrown into confusion upon their approach of the camels that were moved forward. The riders, some panicked, dismount the fleeing horses, but they are rendered useless on foot, wielding their now unbalanced and clumsy riding lances. Soon, they are cut down by the Persian cavalry, and what few survivors there are flee the battlefield. The Persian cavalry, having routed the Lydian cavalry, now wheels inwards and strikes at the Lydian infantry on the wings from the flanks and the rear. Soon, the Lydian flanks are crushed from all sides. Those who survive the onslaught also flee the battlefield. However, Croesus's Egyptian infantry is still moving forward, and their momentum carries them through Cyrus's center of the line. It almost looked as if the Persians would be routed at their center, but they dig in behind and to the side of their archery towers, which cover them with devastating volleys deep into the Lydian ranks. The volleys are so deadly, the Lydian wings begin to crumble and flee. Croesus, on seeing this, also flees the battlefield, leaving his Egyptian infantry to be fully surrounded. However, rather than killing them all, Cyrus, impressed at their courage and tenacity, offers them to join his ranks. They agree to this under the condition they won't have to fight Croesus. Cyrus agrees to this, and they surrender, and Cyrus is victorious. Cyrus returns to his capital and tasks his general Harpagus with annexing the smaller kingdoms of Cilicia, Lycia, and Phoenicia, which lined the continental side around the northeast of the island of Cyprus. By the year 540 BCE, Cyrus has captured Elam and its capital Susa. Yet one great power still remains in Western Asia, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. They are led by their general Nabonidus, who meets Cyrus and his general Gobryas at the Tigris riverside city of Opis. The city was considered strategically important as it shored up the northern defensive end barrier of the Median Wall, which protected the ancient city of Babylon. Cyrus and his troops overrun the Babylonians and then continue unabated towards the city of Babylon. The citizens of the town of Sippar that stand between Cyrus and Babylon surrender without incident, and Cyrus the Great marches into Babylon. He proclaims himself King of Babylon, Sumer, and Akkad, as well as King of the Four Corners of the world. In actuality, the Achaemenid Empire stretches from Asia Minor in the west to the Indus River in the east. Cyrus would rule over his Achaemenid Empire for another 20 years until his death. The accounts of how he died vary, but what does not vary are the accounts of his achievements and his legacy, which would endure even as his physical body turned to dust. Modern Iranians refer to him as the Father. Indeed, according to the Greek philosopher Xenophon, born 100 years after Cyrus' death, he said the following: "Those who were subject to him he treated with esteem and regard as if they were his own children,
while his subjects themselves respected Cyrus as their father. What other man but Cyrus, after having overturned an empire, ever died with the title of the father from the very people whom he had brought under his power? For it is plain fact that this is a name for one that bestows, rather than for one that takes away. The Babylonians themselves did not refer to him as conqueror, but instead liberator. He was distinguished as a statesman and as a soldier, and created a stable political structure and foundation for empire that his son would inherit and expand upon.
In Part 1, we covered the rise of the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great. In this, Part 2, we look at Cyrus's son, Cambyses II. Although his rule was much shorter than his father's, he did much to add to the empire the Persians now referred to simply as Kshasa, which meant this empire. This empire, in 530 BCE under Cyrus, stretches in the east to the far borders of what is now modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, and in the west to the far borders of present-day Turkey. The echoes of the Achaemenid Empire would continue to ring long after its decline and fall, but for now, we will continue to focus on its rise. During Cyrus's conquering of Babylon, his son Cambyses led religious ceremonies for the empire. When Cyrus died, Cambyses became the king of kings. Unlike his father's reign of decades, Cambyses' reign would not even see 1 decade, for he would die 7 years into his rule under mysterious circumstances. However, in these 7 years, he would continue his father's vision of expansion. The one independent state that remained east of where his father had conquered was Egypt. The Pharaoh of Egypt, Ahmose II, whose name meant "the moon is born," was made pharaoh by his own sword arm, killing his predecessor, the Pharaoh Apries. Cambyses had requested aid of Ahmose, aid from a physician specializing in eye care that would come to visit him in his capital. Ahmose complied with this request, but forced the physician by the name of Ujahorsenet to keep his family in Egypt, essentially to maintain a leash on him. The reasons for this is that in addition to being a physician and a priest of Neith, he also controlled a portion of the Egyptian navy as an admiral. Angered at having his family used as pawns, he instead approached Cambyses with an idea: to marry the daughter of the pharaoh and strengthen Persian ties with Egypt, and of course, some personal leverage of his own. Cambyses complied, but Pharaoh Ahmose tricked Cambyses. Rather than send his own daughter, he sent the daughter of the previous pharaoh he had usurped. She was named Nitetis, and she informed Cambyses upon arrival of the deceit. Cambyses was understandably furious, and he wanted to punish Ahmose. Just prior to Ahmose sending Nitetis to Persia, he had fallen out with a Greek councilman, tactician, and mercenary by the name of Phanes of Halicarnassus. Phanes had served the Egyptian court and was well respected by them and the military elite. However, for reasons not truly ever uncovered, the two ended up in disagreement, with Phanes being disgruntled and ultimately wanting to seek out an audience with the Persian emperor. Ahmose, at hearing this, became extremely anxious, and he sent one of his most trusted eunuch guards after Phanes. Phanes, for his part, likely aware of the eunuch guard tailing him, headed instead to Lycia, where unfortunately he was captured. However, ever the tactician, he was able to get the eunuch guards extremely drunk, and when passed out, he made his escape towards the Persian capital. Phanes' timing would be extremely serendipitous, as Cambyses, having already been angered and planning invasion, drilled Phanes of the information required for the invasion to be a success. Phanes counseled him
about the need to request aid of the main Arabian king in the lands between the Persian Empire and Egypt for safe passage through those lands. Cambyses complied and sent a request to the Arabian king. The king himself, also an enemy of the pharaoh, not only complied, but assisted with troops and water for the desert march, first to Gaza and then beyond to Pelusium, the initial target of the invasion. This would be crucial towards the ultimate success for the Persians, as the Egyptian military relied in great part on Phanes's counsel. Ahmose would die 6 months before Cambyses' arrival at Pelusium, leaving his son Psamtik III to push back the Persians. However, Cambyses was also able to gain assistance from the Cypriot towns and from a tyrant, Polycrates of Samos. Polycrates had agreed to back the Egyptian pharaohs, but was swayed via a massive bribe payment to back the Persians instead. Cambyses and his troops left the capital and entered the Arabian lands, and true to his word, the Arabian king provided them food and drink along the length of the route via various way stations. The first target and only direct resistance encountered would be at Gaza. The Persians put Gaza to siege, a siege that will continue even after the upcoming battle. The larger balance of the Persian forces continued on towards Pelusium and Memphis beyond. Psamtik became incensed at hearing the Persian advance and of Phanes's betrayal, so incensed that he rounded up Phanes's male children, stood them between two bowls, and had them cut one by one, draining their blood and mixing it with wine, which he and his councilmen drank before the battle. Polycrates and the Cypriots would ensure that the Egyptians would not be able to make use of the Mediterranean and force them to bunker on the land instead. Psamtik had stationed his troops along the fork of the Red Sea where it neared the Nile. If the inhabitants of Pelusium had hoped to surrender, that hope was dashed, as Psamtik had his troops fall back into the city as the Persians neared. According to the Greek historian Ctesias, the Persians fought ferociously and were said to employ sacred Egyptian animals like cats in the battle to instill maximum fear into the Egyptians. The Persian immortals, usually reserved in battle, fought at the front ranks and cut down thousands of Egyptians. The victory was said to be so lopsided, the Egyptians lost 7 men for every Persian downed. When it became clear that the Persians had the upper hand, panic struck the Egyptians, who would flee in droves, falling back to the city of Memphis. According to another Greek historian, Herodotus, Cambyses was reluctant to shed more blood despite his victory at Pelusium, and he offered the Egyptians in Memphis an end to the struggle. He sent a Persian herald in a ship to relay this offer. It was said the Egyptians, upon seeing the Persian vessel, rushed out and attacked the ship, killing all on board and taking their torn limbs with them back into Memphis. Cambyses was soon upon the city, and he subjected it to his siege tactics. The Egyptian losses in Memphis were even greater, at 10 for every Persian loss, and it is said a further 2,000 Egyptians died. Soon, the city fell, even while Gaza was still under siege. The pharaoh attempted to flee the city, but he was quickly captured, and he was allowed to live under Persian watch, but would end up committing suicide after attempting a revolt against his new overlords, a revolt that would be crushed in its entirety. The Achaemenid Empire now annexed Egypt into its possession, with Cambyses as its new pharaoh, putting an end to the 26th dynasty. The Libyan kingdom beyond sued for peace, which the Persians granted. The remaining 3 years of Cambyses' life are filled with historical uncertainty. There are hints of a failed invasion into the Kushite kingdom south of Egypt, but no factual certainty that this occurred. There are carved reliefs that show a Kushite delegation offering tributes of ivory, incense, and an okapi for the zoo of the King of Kings. Similarly, there are hints of a planned conquest of Carthage in the west,
said to have not taken place due to the unwillingness of the Phoenicians to fight their own kin. Where the truth lies in these is difficult to discern. However, what we do know is that Cambyses died either from an accidental or self-inflicted thigh wound in 522. There's some debate as to how long or if there was a Persian prince by the name of Bardiya who sat on the Achaemenid throne while Cambyses campaigned in Egypt. However, we know with certainty that in the same year of his death, he would be succeeded by Darius. That brings us to the end of Part 2 of the Persia Rises series. In Part 3, we'll take a look at Darius, who along with Cyrus was one of only a handful of King of Kings to bear that title.
Adam Daryawash, Sha'ithya Wazraka, Sha'ithya Sha'ithyanum, Sha'ithya Parse, Sha'ithya Dachyunum.
Most historical sources agree that between Cambyses' death and the ascension of Darius to the Achaemenid throne, there sat an usurper. Either this person was Bardiya, also known as Smerdis, a brother of Cambyses, or it was Gamauda, a Zoroastrian priest, impersonating the brother. This is an absolutely fascinating period of time. There's much speculation and a variety of possibilities. However, I want to ensure that we utilize factual historical evidence when possible. Wherever the truth lies with regards to who the usurper was and his period of time on the throne, we pick up our series on the Achaemenid Empire with Darius' ascension. Darius was crowned the new King of Kings in Pasargadae, but he would hold his court in the city of Ecbatana. Darius spent over a year quelling rebellions throughout the empire. We know this thanks to Darius' own account on what is known as the Behistun inscriptions. The inscription located on Mount Behistun contains text in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, which starts with Darius providing an autobiographical account of his lineage and that of the empire, and ends with details on his quelling of the rebellions that arose during his first year on the throne, saying, "These 9 kings did I capture in these wars. As to these provinces which revolted, lies made them revolt, so that they deceived the people. Then Ahura Mazda delivered them into my hand, and I did unto them according to my will. You, who shall be king hereafter, protect yourself vigorously from lies. Punish the liars well, if thus you shall think, may my country be secure." We know that a small loyal group of nobles assisted Darius with his ascension. One of these, Intiphernes, was killed by Darius with the accusation leveled against him of intended rebellion. The other nobles who had helped place Darius on the throne disavowed any connection with Intiphernes. While Darius spent most of his first year in an almost constant state of reactive conflict, he would introduce much reform and advancement into the empire over the duration of his reign. The idea of dividing the empire into provinces and placing governors called satraps to rule them was something Cyrus and others in the region had done before Darius, with each satrap essentially serving as viceroy to the king and given a substantial level of autonomy. However, Darius gave the satraps a definitive structure and increased their number to 36. He also unified the coinage of the empire under a single system, in addition to building roads and introducing standard weights and measures, which greatly assisted commerce throughout the empire. The initial revolt he put down was an uprising in Babylon, a revolt initiated and led by Nebuchadnezzar III, who took advantage of a local noble, Otanes, who had removed his forces to assist Darius. Darius felt betrayed that the people of Babylon supported Nebuchadnezzar, and he put the city to siege. The city remained resilient for 18 months, even mocking Darius during the siege with a taunt that he would only take the city when mules have foals. According to legend, Darius finally gained access to the city
when a high-ranking soldier of his had a mule who foaled. Darius sent Zopyrus into Babylon, having him pose as a deserter. Zopyrus was able to gain the trust of the Babylonians and stealthily open the city gates, allowing Darius and his troops entrance into the city. Once inside, the city was taken quickly, and Nebuchadnezzar was put to death. As with this rebellion, Darius's enemies consistently took advantage of power vacuums to initiate their revolts. Another such rebellion that occurred while Darius had Babylon under siege occurred when the Scythians took advantage and attacked. Darius, having addressed the Babylon revolt, first put down revolts in Elam and Assyria, before finally moving on to the Scythians. As he neared, they fled the province, heading back towards their lands near the Black Sea. In pursuit of them, he crossed the Black Sea at the Bosphorus Strait, where present-day Istanbul sits, using a bridge of boats. The Scythians employed hit-and-run guerrilla tactics against the Persians. This frustrated Darius, and he took the unusual step of writing the Scythian leader to either fight or surrender. While the Scythians refused to surrender, Darius would ultimately be victorious, as the Scythians would employ scorched earth tactics in addition to the hit and run. This had the result of damaging their own lands and angering their allies, whose lands he employed these tactics in. As Darius moved eastwards, the attrition rate of his forces could not be overlooked. Low on supplies, troops, and morale, Darius stopped on the banks of the Arose, where he would build 8 great forts that were spaced roughly 13 kilometers apart from each other, and headed back towards Thrace. While not conquered in their entirety, Darius was able to instill respect in the Scythians, enough so they would not trouble the Persians again for some time. With the rebellions quelled, Darius embarked on a campaign to Egypt, where he defeated the armies of a self-proclaimed pharaoh by the name of Petubastis. Petubastis had taken advantage during the period of instability just before and during the first year of Darius's rule. Darius resecured the Egyptian lands that Cambyses had conquered. In 516 BCE, Darius turned his attention towards the Indus Valley. He first passed through Arya and Bactria, and then eastward into present-day Afghanistan and Taxila, in present-day Pakistan, which lies east of the Indus River. He spent that winter in the Gandhara region before campaigning south to Karachi. Once in Karachi, he sent a Greek retainer by the name of Skylax of Karyanda to explore the Indian Ocean south of Karachi, west to Suez. Darius then marched through the Bolan Pass, and then Arcosia and Drangia, finally back to Persia. The empire had encompassed the western shores of Turkey. At that time, the population there was predominantly Greek. Since Cyrus had taken control of the area in 540 BCE, the satraps ruled those lands from Sardis on behalf of the emperor, appointing local rulers to provide local government on their behalf. Some of these men would be cruel tyrants. In 499 BCE, one such tyrant by the name of Aristagoras from Milesia launched an attack with the Persian satrap Artaxerxes to conquer Naxos. However, the mission was a complete and utter failure. Sensing his imminent overthrow as a tyrant, Aristagoras chose instead to incite the whole of Ionia into rebellion against Darius. In 498 BCE, with the support of troops and ships from Athens and Eretria, the Ionians marched on Sardis and razed it. Darius sent Mardonius, one of his leading military commanders, to crush the uprising. Mardonius conquered Macedonia in 492, but allowed them to retain the autonomy that they had enjoyed since the 6th century. In 490, Darius assembled another army, this time consisting of 20,000 men under his admiral Datis and nephew Artaxerxes. They captured Eretria and marched on to Marathon. Just outside of Marathon, the Persian forces met a heavily armed Athenian army consisting of 9,000 men who were supported by 600 Plataeans and 10,000 lightly armed soldiers led by Miltiades. However, the Persians would be defeated, ending the first Persian invasion of Greece. Darius in 486 was preparing for a second invasion that he would command himself. When he died, the task would be left to his son Xerxes. Darius was embalmed and entombed in a rock-cut tomb that he had built for himself several years earlier. In addition to the reforms, Darius would be remembered for his great construction projects, many of these done outside of the capital in the far reaches of the empire. One such project linked the Nile to the Red Sea. Also, numerous temples were built for religions other than his Zoroastrian faith. What was unique about these projects was the inclusion of workers from all regions of the empire, which again enhanced the economies of the empire outside of the capital. This ends part 3 of the Persia Rises series. In part 4, we take a look at Darius' son, Xerxes. The year is 486 BCE, and the Achaemenid Empire is in turmoil. Uprisings in Egypt, Babylon, Bactria have kept the newly crowned King of Kings, known to us as Xerxes I, busy. His father Darius had died with plans to invade Greece unfulfilled. Xerxes continues those plans, even as he is quelling revolt in Egypt, where he crushes the forces backing the revolt. Xerxes' support of Zoroastrianism was perhaps more zealous than that of the Shahs before him, at least according to documentation that survives. For example, in response to either the Babylonian or Bactrian revolt, an inscription of Xerxes states, "And among these countries there was one where previously Devas had been worshipped. Afterward, through Ahura Mazda's favor, I destroyed this sanctuary of Devas and proclaimed, 'Let Devas not be worshipped.' There, where Devas had been worshipped before, I worshipped Ahura Mazda." Xerxes had no desire to return to Greece, preferring peace and diplomacy. However, those around him were more eager for revenge and pushed Xerxes for the renewal of hostilities. Some of the Persian elite had not forgiven the Athenians, Naxians, and Eretrians for the Ionian revolt, the burning of Sardis, and their victory at Marathon. However, aware of the scale of his father's army's losses, he ultimately remains patient and takes his time from 484 BCE to 481 BCE with preparations. His army is being restocked from all parts of the empire and is truly one of the most ethnically diverse armies the world had yet seen. Xerxes' generals and their engineers designed pontoon bridges for the Hellespont. To accommodate the supplies his massive invasion force will require, supplies are stationed along the length of the route at way stations. In addition to the pontoon bridges, the engineers build a 2-kilometer-long canal that bisects peninsula at the base of Mount Athos. With everything in place, Xerxes and his army begin their march towards the Hellespont. A day out, and the weather takes a turn for the worse. A massive thunderstorm whips the bridge they had built, and within hours, the flax and papyrus cables weaken and begin to fray, snapping completely before the troops are able to cross. Xerxes is furious, and it is said that he ordered the strait itself lashed 300 times. In 480 BCE, Xerxes sets out again from Sardis with an estimated 60,000 troops. Most sources agree that 10,000 elite immortals accompanied Xerxes for this campaign. Some accounts, though, like that of Herodotus, should perhaps be taken with a grain of salt. His writings state that Xerxes oversaw the crossing of his army of 5 million and almost 1,000 ships over the course of 7 days. This was perhaps egregiously overstated to make the end result all the more appealing and heroic. Modern estimates, while still very high, lower the totals to some 80 to 100,000 soldiers, while supporting the number of ships at around 1,000. Accompanying Xerxes was Artemisia I of Caria, a Greek queen of Halicarnassus, and several generals, including Mardonius and Hydarnes, who led the Immortals. The Greek side was led by Sparta and Athens, and only a few other Greek city-state allies, as most remained neutral or joined the Persian side. They totaled approximately 80,000 soldiers, and had about half the number of Persian ships at 400. The Persian army next marches through Thrace and Macedon to Thessaly. A Greek general by the name of Themistocles proposes that the allies block the advance of the Persian army at the pass of Thermopylae, while their navy blocks the Persians at the Straits of Artemisium. The other generals agree, and a Greek force of 7,000 men, led by the Spartan king Leonidas, heads towards the pass to fortify a position. The Persian army arrives in either late August or early September. The resulting battle has been the focus of many movies, including the woefully inaccurate 300. What was true is that for 7 days, Leonidas and his force of 7,000 held off the Persians. In the process, the Persians lost 20,000 men, and the Greeks over half of their force. It is said that a Greek traitor informed the Persians of a means to flank the Greeks. King Leonidas had scouts that informed him of the impending flank, and he ordered the remaining bulk of the force to withdraw, retaining 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and some sources indicate also 900 Helots and 400 Thebans. Leonidas and his remaining forces were able to hold out for an additional 2 days before being overrun. The Persian army was an army built for tactical warfare on native open plains where cavalry could be used. Secondly, the Persian light infantry did have lighter armor. For example, rather than metallic shields, they tended to use predominantly wicker shields. Again, this was an army designed to take advantage of open plains via masses of archer arrow volleys and flanking cavalry attacks. What the Greeks were able to do with less numbers is nullify the Persian advantages and enhance the Persian negatives. While this was all playing out on land, the Greek and Persian fleets met at what is now known as the Battle of Artemisium. While the battle was considered a tactical stalemate, the Greeks were able to down 400 Persian ships and only lose 100, effectively balancing the numbers between them shipwise. The Greeks, now aware of what transpired on land, make the decision to tactfully withdraw to Salamis. In the process of withdrawing, the Athenians abandon Athens. Xerxes and his army overrun Phocis and then Bootia before sacking the now abandoned Athens. Xerxes came very close to having the Greek city-states capitulate. However, the tides would begin to turn. The Greek city-states moved their armies further south to fortify the Isthmus of Corinth, as the Persians now held all the territory north of the Isthmus. The Greek allies were then persuaded by Themistocles to attack the Persian fleet again, now that the numbers were more equal and the terrain favored the Greeks. The Persian army rode into the Straits of Salamis, where their superior numbers would turn out to be a hindrance. The Persians, unable to organize, whereas the Greeks were lined up and able to score a victory. Xerxes makes the decision to leave Mardonius to complete the conquest of Greece, as he feared the Greeks destroying the bridges at the Hellespont and stranding his armies on the Greek side of the divide. Xerxes, with a large contingent, heads back to Persia. In 479 BCE, the two sides would fight in the final land battle of the Second Persian invasion of Greece. The Greek side, as stated earlier, had better armor and shields, and an argument could be made for them also having a better quality of forged weapon. However, the cavalry, which was also mentioned earlier, was still a definitive advantage that the Persians held, and yet to date they had been unable to field them effectively. They were truly the masters of their native terrain and designed as such. On an open field with cavalry at the ready, several of the battles may have played out much differently. The Greek Spartan, Pausanias, leading the allies, of course, knew this all too well and purposely worked to keep the armies apart until the cavalry would be of insignificance and the terrain at their advantage. The Spartans in particular were able to send the largest army they had ever fielded, consisting of almost 100,000 soldiers. When the dust settled, the Greeks were victorious, as again, their superior tactics and weaponry would win the day. The battle not only marked the end of Xerxes' plans for Greece, it would mark the turning point for the Greek city-states with regard to naval superiority. After this point, their ships would rule the Mediterranean. However, Xerxes and the Persian leadership learned from these tough and bitter lessons as well. After this disaster, they ensured that Greek mercenaries would make up a much larger percentage of their total fighting forces. This would ensure that they retained superiority on their native terrain types, but also along the borders and into foreign lands. Considering Xerxes had not been a proponent for the invasion, he was now able to work on what he considered much more vital objectives for the empire, and that includes completion of several construction projects. One of these was the building of the Gate of All Nations. Another, the Hall of 100 Columns at Persepolis. Both were massive and prominent portions of his palace. He also completed his father's palace at Takara and the treasury Darius had started. Perhaps the most significant construction project, however, was the completion of upgrades to the Royal Road, which was the main artery of communication through the heart of the Achaemenid Empire. Couriers were able to traverse the 2,700 kilometers in 9 days, whereas foot traffic took approximately 90. Of note is the praise Herodotus had for the couriers, saying, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." Now, if that sounds a little familiar,
It's because it's the inscription for the USPS building in New York City. In August of 465 BCE, Artabanus, the commander of Xerxes' royal bodyguard, assassinates Xerxes with assistance from a eunuch by the name of Aspamitris. There are a few different versions of what transpired. One version, according to the Greek historian Ctesias, has Artabanus accusing the crown prince Darius of the murder, which prompts revenge by another of Xerxes' children, Artaxerxes, to kill Darius. What we know is that Artaxerxes would take the throne, not the heir apparent Xerxes. Artabanus then leaves the historical records after doing so, suggesting he may have been killed to avenge Xerxes' death. In the next episode, we're going to follow the life and reign of Artaxerxes. It is 465 BCE, and the mighty Persian Achaemenid Empire's influence stretches across 3 continents. Across this, 20 satrapies and various cultures. But unlike many other empires to come, retaining native cultural identities was encouraged. The Persian Empire of the Achaemenids was almost unique among the world's empires in that their form of administration relied heavily on the continued goodwill of the populations towards their administrative satrapy. Well-maintained roads connected the various satrapies to the empire's capital of Persepolis. The Persians never imposed their language and culture upon those they conquered and/or assimilated. The various satrapies communicated to their populations via whatever local language was in use in that region, and often aided by the use of Aramaic, which local populations understood if the other languages in use were too numerous, with no clear majority language spoken. However, their tolerance of language, culture, and religion should not be mistaken for weakness. Those who crossed them could and would feel the full force of Achaemenid justice. Once crossed, this tolerance could come to a very swift end, and populations could, aside from being acted upon militarily, be forcibly deported elsewhere in the empire. While the actual number of troops were nowhere near as high as the Greeks would go on to claim in their version of history, it was a formidable force. The same force that grew the empire could also, if required, police it and pass judgment of might upon it. Artaxerxes, son of the now dead Xerxes, is in Pasargadae at the royal residence, surrounded by the elder Zoroastrian priests to initiate the coronation ceremony, proclaiming him the new king of kings. He would be referred to in the history books to come by multiple names. To the Romano-Jewish historian Josephus, he would be referred to by the same name as the founder, Cyrus. The Greeks referred to him as long-handed or long-armed due to the fact his right arm was said to be longer than his left. His ascension was tainted with bloodshed, as both versions of the events that transpired after his father died have him killing to obtain his crown. In one account, it's his brother, whereas in the other, it is him killing one of his father's bodyguards. The method of governance that Darius had put in place had proved its worth and created an era of stability that Artaxerxes would inherit and benefit from. He would, after the failures of his father and Shahs before him, however, take a different strategy with Greece. Rather than confront Athens and her allies, he would weaken the Athenians by directly funding their enemies in Greece. In response, the Athenians moved the treasury of the Delian League that they belonged to from the more neutral Delos to their capital in the Acropolis. This did not paint the Athenians in the greatest of light among their Delian allies, and it would become a source of contention in the future. Artaxerxes would also lend assistance to his father's most notable enemy, Themistocles. The very Themistocles who was the Athenian hero at the Battle of Salamis would see his popularity eroded through a series of events culminating in his exile from Greece. It was said that after Salamis, he became increasingly arrogant and his prestige and power grew, but much of this could have come from those who envied his stature and the resulting power that came with it. He would be implicated in a treason plot, and though acquitted, his building of a statue near his home that espoused his glory as Athens, and by extension Greek hero, was for many the last straw, and he found himself ostracized. For a short time, he found sanctuary with Alexander I of Macedon, but he would continue on to the heart of his previous enemy's capital, where he gained an audience with Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes, who had adopted the alternate strategy with regards to Greece, not only accepted Themistocles, but made him a governor of Magnesia, as well as Myus and Lampsacus, to, it was said, maintain him in bread, meat, and wine, things those cities were notable for. In addition,
he was given Skepsis to provide him with clothes, and Percote to provide him with bedding. In return, Themistocles would govern and take on the Persian language and customs as he lived out his final years. As with those who came before him, Artaxerxes would be dealing with unrest in the empire. However, as mentioned previously, Darius's reforms would mostly help quell these. However, Egypt, as it had in the past, would again attempt to displace the Persians from their rule. Between 460 and 454, the Libyan king Inros II, like his grandfather Psamtik III, would take up arms against Persia. Inros would be aided by Persia's sworn nemesis, the Athenians. The very Athenians who now dominated the Mediterranean shipping lanes were led by Admiral Cimon. The Persian forces, led by the satrap of Egypt and either the brother or uncle of Inros II, Achaemenids. It was said that Inros overthrew his uncle on land, while the Athenians won triumphantly over the Persian fleet just off of Egypt's coast. Artaxerxes attempted at first to gain an alliance with the Spartans, but failing this, he sent a relieving force under Megabyzus. Megabyzus first laid siege to what the Egyptians called the White Wall of Memphis. He did this as many of the Persians were being held captive inside those walls. He was patient, and within a year defeated Inros and his Athenian allies, forcing them both to flee to Byblus, which stood in the Nile Delta. Showing yet even more patience, Megabyzus managed to secure their surrender and eventual retreat. Out of this, a new order would arise with the signing of a treaty called the Peace of Calais, negotiated between the Persians and an Athenian politician whom the treaty is named after, Calais. It provided autonomy to the Ionian states and enforced geographic limitations upon both Persia and the Greek city-states of the Delian League with regards to where they could and could not go in the shared frontier between the powers. Artaxerxes was also known for improving the situation for the Jewish population in Israel. He appointed an Orthodox scribe by the name of Ezra to act as a court official for Jewish affairs, which essentially became an almost autonomous entity. And after 7 years, Ezra would, along with 1,500 exiled Jewish families, enter Jerusalem, where they were authorized to resume restoration of the temple and its walls that had previously been ordered by Cyrus. Artaxerxes would have 17 sons to various concubines, and as with previous kings, would resume the massive construction projects, including the completion of the Hall of 100 Columns in Persepolis started by his father. In 424, Artaxerxes joined his predecessors in death, leaving the crown to one of his sons, Xerxes II of Persia. Unfortunately, his reign would not see the passing of 2 moons before he too would be dead, initiating a period of instability that we will cover in Part 6 of the series. We pick up Part 6 of the Persia Rises series in 424 BCE. The Achaemenid Empire of the Persians is now past its zenith. This great and mighty empire which Cyrus the Great had founded and successors like Cambyses and Darius the Great expanded, still for now stretches into 3 continents. Almost half of the world's population of just over 100 million profess fealty to the kings of kings. The mighty Roman Empire, while claiming 65 million a half millennium later by comparison, only ruled over 1/5 of the world. However, the sands of time are ever shifting, and the only permanence is that there is no permanence. The greatest of empires will eventually fall, no matter how unlikely that may seem, at the height of their greatness. Artaxerxes I died in 424, leaving his son Xerxes II as the new king of kings of the mighty Achaemenid Empire. However, his ascension was not without contention. Both of his illegitimate brothers, Ochus and Sogdianus, also claimed the throne for themselves. Accounts of this interim period are not only vague, but they vary considerably. One theory is that all three were for a time declared rulers and recognized by various regions. Xerxes II recognized in the Persian heartland, Darius in Hyrcania, Media, Babylonia, and Egypt, and Sogdianus in Elam. It is surmised that 45 days into the reign of Xerxes II in the Persian heartland, he was assassinated by his half-brother, Sogdianus. Sogdianus was supposedly the child of Artaxerxes I and Queen Damaspia. After a longer rule, but still short at just over 6 months, he's said to have been suffocated in ash by his brother Ochus. The reason claimed for ash, it is said, was because he had sworn that his brother would not be killed by the sword, by poison, or by hunger. Now, with the crown going to Ochus III of Artaxerxes' many children, Ochus took the name Darius to become known by historians as Darius II. The Greeks, however, were not as kind with their nickname for him of Darius Nothos, or Darius the Bastard. Prior to his ascension, Darius was satrap of Hyrcania, which was the area of land around the southeast of the Caspian Sea. Darius lacked the autonomy of previous kings and was said to have been dominated by a handful of court eunuchs as well as his mother and wife. His wife, Parysatis, was said to have been both cruel and overly ambitious. Complicating matters, but explaining much of her ambition, was being a half-brother to her husband. So rather than marrying into power, she had already belonged to one of the most powerful families in the empire. As with other kings, Darius faced revolts and rebellions, two early such revolts occurring in his former satrapy of Hyrcania and one in Media. Darius managed to suppress these in fairly short order. However, no sooner were they quelled than the hotbed of revolts, Egypt, revolted yet again, this time in 411 under Amarteus, who was related to a general who assisted in Arose II during the rule of Artaxerxes I. Their revolt took the form of a guerrilla uprising, with the rebels striking the Persians around the Nile Delta, only to melt back into the delta after the strike, making them a difficult foe to put down. We know also that during Darius's rule, the Persians managed to reclaim tracts of Ionia. This was initiated when the satraps of Asia Minor, Tissaphernes, and Pharnabazus were mandated to collect long overdue tributes. An alliance was formed with Sparta against Athens. One of Darius's last actions saw him appoint his son Cyrus the Younger as commander-in-chief of Asia Minor, replacing Tissaphernes, the previous commander. He also poured the empire's resources into rebuilding the Spartan fleet, which was critical in the Spartan victory over the Athenians in 405 at the Battle of Aegospotami. Darius II, however, would die the following year in 404. Succeeding Darius was his son Artemis, whom he had fathered with his half-sister Parysatis. Artemis was crowned in Persargadae and took the name Artaxerxes, becoming Artaxerxes II. Just after his father's death, Amarteus of Egypt, who had started his revolt in 411, managed to secure victory over the Persians in Egypt after the 7-year guerrilla campaign. Another common theme of the Achaemenid rulers would impact the newly crowned King of Kings, a brother with a counterclaim to the throne. His half-brother, Cyrus the Younger, who had been appointed a satrap of Asia Minor by their father, started his claim and said it was based on being born after their father and his mother took to the throne, whereas he argued Artaxerxes II was born prior to their father sitting on the throne. Artaxerxes had hoped to resolve this peacefully, but negotiations with his half-brother fell through. Cyrus took up arms, backed by an army of mercenary Greeks called the 10,000. With this army, he planned to take the throne. The first major battle would see Cyrus's army win a tactical victory, but at the expense of his own life, rendering it a moot point. It is said that Cyrus fell at the hands of Mithridates, a young Persian soldier who it was said killed Cyrus accidentally, not even realizing what he had done until later in the battle. The story goes that Cyrus, knowing the victory was his, passed through his enemy's lines, yelling, "Clear the way, villains, clear the way," which many Persians, many even kneeling to him, acknowledging. However, during this, his crown dropped off his head, and Mithridates, running by, struck him in the temple with a dart. Cyrus would bleed out and die within minutes, and Mithridates was treated as a hero by Artaxerxes and given much riches on the condition that he and others maintain that it was Artaxerxes who scored the killing blow. For the same reason men boast of things they have done or wish they had, Mithridates began to boast at the party as he got progressively more drunk, eventually yelling that it was he who scored the killing blow and not Artaxerxes. This turned out to be a fatal mistake, as Artaxerxes would have him executed in a ghastly and macabre way by pinning him between stacked boats with his arms and legs dangling out the sides, his face covered in honey to attract flies, and he would be force-fed. This would of course lead to bodily functions that would go uncleaned, and the same flies that had been feasting on the honey would procreate and lay their eggs in the fecal matter, which eventually saw eggs being laid in his gastrointestinal tract and die. The top boat would then be removed to the squishy sound of fly larvae hungrily devouring what was left of his flesh. All in all, definitely not a kingly way to go. As with his last few predecessors, the King of Kings had learned their lessons well against the Greeks. Rather than engage directly, they would fight via proxies. This proved not only much more effective, it also had the side benefit of sparing Persian lives, as the Greeks were left to fight amongst themselves mostly. To reel Sparta in, they subsidized Sparta's enemies, the Persians providing massive subsidies to the Athenians, Thebans, Corinthians, in the form of tens of thousands of Achaemenid darics. The resulting political fallout of this was the Corinthian War, which would last between 396 and 387. In the war's major naval battle at Cnidus in 394, the Achaemenids and their proxy allies managed to destroy the Spartan fleet in its entirety. However, Artaxerxes II would slyly and stealthily reverse course almost immediately after this victory and come to terms with Sparta. He would give them control of the Greek mainland in return for the cities of Ionia and Aeolus on the Anatolian coast. What many history books often overlook is the political masterclass the Persians delivered with the Peace of Antalcidas. All those Greek victories came at a cost to the Greeks. The losses forced the Persians to adapt, and adapt they did. The Persians would fight Greece by pitting Greeks against themselves. Not only did the Persians assist in initiating the Corinthian War, they spelled out the terms of its peace, terms that would restore the status quo of Ionia back to the Persians, and with only Greek blood spilled to write those terms. Artaxerxes next had to deal with an internal threat. The Cadusian and Iranian people who lived in the land to the immediate southwest of the Caspian Sea were in the process of revolting, having refused the payment of tribute. Artaxerxes personally led the campaign into the Cadusian territory, which was extremely mountainous. At first, it appeared to be not so wise a strategy, as food for his massive army of what we are told was 300,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry was in short supply. Even if we conservatively assume the actual numbers were much lower, there's no doubt that food was scarce for tens of thousands of people and animals. However, as he had done with the Greeks, Artaxerxes was able to rely on political maneuvers rather than having to spill Persian blood. Thanks to the idea of one of his generals, Tribasus, whose plan was to speak to one of the opposing two Caducean chieftains, while the other general, Datames, did the same. They would each convince their chief that the other was suing for peace with the Achaemenids. The end result was complete capitulation of both and a bending of the knee to the Achaemenids. What would an Achaemenid king's reign be without conflict in Egypt? Artaxerxes attempted to regain control of Egypt and sent Pharnabazus, the satrap of Hellespontine Phrygia. Pharnabazus had proven his mettle against the Spartans and, wishing to repeat his past successes, spent 4 methodical years in the Levant practicing his military response to Egypt. Historical records state that a force of 200,000 Persian troops was raised, along with 300 triremes, 200 galleys, and 12,000 Greek mercenaries under Iphicrates, a Greek general renowned for his contributions to tactical warfare of the period. While these forces were being prepared, Artaxerxes' inner circle had been attempting to convince Athens to summon back one of their generals by the name of Chabrias, who was assisting the Egyptians. However, the Athenians did not comply. The end result is that while the Persians had 12,000 Greek mercenaries, the Egyptians likewise had a Greek mercenary presence. While the Persians had been training for contingencies, they had not factored in the variable of deployment speed. When they landed near Mendes in 373, their forces were too slow, giving the Egyptians the benefit of that critical variable of time. The Egyptians under Pharaoh Nectanebo not only strengthened their defenses, but they flooded areas of the Nile Delta to further slow the Persian advance. The other thing the variable of time allowed for was dissension, and by the time the Persians and their mercenary allies had neared Memphis, there was substantial infighting and disagreement between Pharnabazus and the Greek general Iphicrates. To make matters even more dire, helping the Egyptian flood efforts was nature itself, which served to expand the scope of the flooding to such an extent that the Egyptian morale had gone from one of certain defeat to overwhelming victory, while that of the Persians ebbed with the very flow of the waters around them. Pharnabazus, who was no young man at 70 years of age, called off their plans and headed back to Persia. The Persians were able to contain the Egyptians, however, as they had attempted to invade Phoenicia. By this time, the aging Pharnabazus had been replaced by Datames. Datames then attempted a second expedition to Egypt, but this too failed before gaining the required traction. The failures in Egypt resonated with many of the satrapies in Asia Minor, and they too began to rebel against Artaxerxes in what history recorded as the Great Satraps' Revolt. The satrapies of Datames, Ariobarnazes, and Orontes of Armenia directly, and a handful of others indirectly, supported the rebellion. Pharaoh Nectanebo of Egypt backed the rebelling satraps directly with monetary funds, and he re-established ties with both Sparta and Athens. Artaxerxes made this his main focus, and by 362 was able to quash the revolt. During the latter years of this revolt, Artaxerxes again tried to mediate in conflicts between the Greek city-states. However, as had been his policies, he ensured that Persia would get the most out of any mediations, so this time he secretly threw his support behind the Thebans, who were at war with Sparta. He sent Phylacus of Abydos, who was a military commander of the satrap Ariobarzanes, to Delphi, where the negotiations were taking place. However, the Thebans were stubborn, and when asked to return Messenia to the Spartans, they refused. Messenia, in the southwest, was viewed as being too strategic a location by the Thebans, and of course, an extension of the homeland to the Spartans. Phylacus used funds to finance additional troops for the Spartans prior to leaving the peace conference. This allowed Sparta to continue the conflict and resulting war. It's said He may have also offered and provided funds to the Athenians. In the autumn of 367, the Spartans, Athenians, Arcadians, Argives, Eleans, and Thebans, along with a handful of other city-states, sent their diplomats to Susa to obtain Achaemenid support in the ongoing conflict. Diplomats that were to ensure the information was forwarded to Artaxerxes in his capital. In what was perhaps a diplomatic misstep, Artaxerxes responded to the city-states with a proposal that was obviously tipped towards the Thebans, which the other city-states wasted no time in rejecting. Sparta and Athens, seemingly taking a page from the Achaemenid new playbook for Greek interference, made a resolution to support the opponents of the Achaemenids. The Athenians sent a large mercenary force to Egypt under Tiberius, one of their generals. Artaxerxes would increasingly spend funds on building projects as he got older. Projects like the restoration of the palace of Darius I at Susa, and other projects like defensive fortifications around Ecbatana. One enemy that no empire, emperor, or king has been able to outrun, though, was time, and Artaxerxes would prove no exception. He would die either in his late 70s or 80s, depending on which records you adhere to, having lived a life ranging from harem intrigue and much conflict. His son, Artaxerxes III, would succeed him as the last ruler of any significant length. However, a storm was already brewing in Macedon, a storm that would threaten the very foundation of the Achaemenids and their centuries-old empire. The year is 358 BCE, and the 11th King of Kings has taken the Persian Achaemenid throne. He is Artaxerxes III, born by the name Ochus to his father, Artaxerxes II. He had been a satrap as well as an army commander during his father's reign, and he was already older than most of the previous kings, being in his late 60s. As with many of his predecessors, his first act upon taking the throne was ensuring his siblings would not vie for what was now his. He had 80 of them executed to remove the potential of this threat. It is speculated via a few sources that he kept his father's death quiet for almost 10 months to build the infrastructure required for this massive purge. Unbeknownst to Artaxerxes III, a shadow was rising in the north of the Greek city-states. Philip II of Macedon had taken the Macedonian throne in the year prior to Artaxerxes' ascension. The Macedonian shadow would continue to rise and soon envelop all around it. Nothing and no one would be safe from its influence, even if for now it was but a distant threat. It has been surmised that the first of the mighty kings of kings would have known this shadow for what it was, would have seen it rising even now, and would have been able to shine a bright light upon it to diminish its potential even before its rise. However, the version of the Achaemenid Empire that existed in 358 BCE was not the vision Cyrus had breathed life into. In many ways, while it mirrored it in size, it was not filled with the cohesion it once had, and it suffered from weak, petty, jealous, and bitter satraps, who spent as much time fighting amongst themselves as they did with the King of Kings at its center. Oblivious to all but what impacted them directly, a threat such as this was given space, and more importantly, time to gain momentum. As they bickered, the shadow in Macedon would grow only larger. Artaxerxes knew that for his central authority to have substance and meaning, he would need to silence the rebellious satraps and put an end to their revolts. First, he entered the territory of the Caduci. The future, last true king of kings, Codomanus, known to us as Darius III, distinguished himself as a leader during this campaign. Artaxerxes came to terms with the leadership of the Caduci to lay down their arms. He then turned his attention back to the other satraps and forced them to dismiss any mercenary soldiers in their employ. The King's Peace of 387 BCE, also referred to as the Peace of Antalcidas, was guaranteed by his father, Artaxerxes II. It ended the Corinthian War and ensured high levels of autonomy for many of the Greek city-states. In 357, the Social War, or War of the Allies, was fought until 355. Athens and their Second Athenian League had fought against the allied city-states of Chios, Rhodes, Kos, and Byzantium. Artaxerxes forced the Athenians to accept a peace accord, removing their troops from Anatolia and leaving rebellious Greek city-states to determine their own future. Next, Artaxerxes turned his attention towards Egypt, which had been separated from the empire now for 60 years. Not quite long enough for him to have forgotten, however, given he was a young man in his early 20s when they left. He had not forgotten or forgiven the Egyptians for this transgression. With Egyptian Pharaoh Nectanebo II supporting rebellion in Asia Minor, he had the excuse he needed. He raised a massive army through a series of levies and marched into Egypt to engage Nectanebo. At first, Artaxerxes had some minor successes, but the Egyptians managed to hold out long enough to receive Greek mercenary support. The two Greek generals, Athenian Diophantus and Spartan Lamius, joined Nectanebo. They collided with the Persians, who suffered a massive defeat, forcing Artaxerxes to leave Egypt and stay his ambitions for Egypt, at least for now. The meddlesome Greeks, as they had throughout the Achaemenid history, proved a worthy, if annoying, foil to the Persians, and Artaxerxes, having now learned this lesson for himself firsthand, went back to the tried and true Achaemenid tactic of countering Greek soldiers and aggression with Greek soldiers and aggression of their own. After his defeat in Egypt, Phoenicia, Anatolia, and Cyprus all declared their independence. In 343, Artaxerxes countered by providing Darius, the Prince of Caria in Asia Minor, with the necessary resources to return Persian order to the upstart satrapies. Darius utilized 8,000 Greek mercenaries, 40 triremes, and put at their head the Athenian war strategist Phocion. In addition, he placed Evagoras, the son of the Cypriot monarch, as co-leader beside Darius. The army deployed on Cyprus and forced a surrender, but had little success elsewhere, causing Artaxerxes to personally lead a force into Babylon and then on into Syria, where he restored order. Sidon, which was the center for the unrest, was betrayed by their monarch. The Sidonians, in response, adopted the scorched earth tactic of burning their own city to the ground. This caused a domino effect of surrender, first in Phoenicia, then in Palestine, and order was restored. Seeing his opportunity, Artaxerxes quickly turned back to Egypt, where he besieged and took Pelusium and Bubastis, and the rest by the last few months of 343. Nectanebo II fled south to Nubia, where he was able to prop up and maintain an independent kingdom, but one that was cut off from the riches of the Nile Delta, making it mostly symbolic. Artaxerxes was hated by the Egyptians prior to taking Egypt, but he was now positively loathed. Egyptians despised him, identifying him as a bull's arse for his act of sacrificing the Apis bull. Artaxerxes did not view the Greeks with the same mutual loathing the Egyptians heaped on him, but instead sought consistently to attempt for peace over war. His first real encounter with Philip II of Macedon was a peace accord of mutual understanding and friendship, one which he seems to have observed even if the details are lost to us millennia later. What we do know is that Greek delegations who sought help from Artaxerxes against Macedon returned empty-handed. However, when Philip II attacked the strategic seaport location of Perinthus, his motivations seemed to have been made clearer to Artaxerxes, who immediately sent troops into Thrace. This is the point historians say Alexander would use as his main motivation to sack the Achaemenid Empire, and not the Persian conflict with Athens centuries earlier. For now, Artaxerxes had managed to restore the empire's territory to its gains under Darius, and with it at least temporarily strengthening central power. In his personal life, he married his niece among others, but given his age, much of his actions seemed almost too late. Had he been a younger man, his restlessness and ambition may have contributed to the Achaemenids with what would be needed to stave off the coming dark Macedonian storm. Alas, it would prove too little, too late, and much of what he had accomplished would be quickly undone after his death in his 80s. What the empire most needed, he could not provide in full, and only full would assist with what was to come. This ends part 7 of the Persia Rises series. The Achaemenid Empire had existed for over 200 years. Under the capable rule of Artaxerxes III, the empire had even made a resurgence. Its borders, and more importantly its influence, was restored across its vast frontiers. However, change was on the doorstep. The empire that had experienced thousands of cuts over its long life but refused to bleed out was about to hemorrhage. A perfect storm at the most inopportune time for the Persians was about to descend upon them. For those 200+ years, the Achaemenid kings of kings and a stable of capable generals had protected the empire from both external and internal influences. Accounts as to Artaxerxes III's cause of death vary. Greek sources say it was a poisoning, and that he was assassinated by his own vizier, a court eunuch by the name of Bagoas. Bagoas was a crafty and cunning politician who had shielded himself from scrutiny through a series of carefully architected alliances. And just prior to the supposed assassination, he had allied himself with the Rhodian mercenary General Mentor, who had played a pivotal role in bringing Egypt back into the empire's fold. Another account, the cuneiform tablet found in an archaeological dig, cites natural causes for the death, but the truth likely lies somewhere in between. Bagoas likely had a hand, given his positioning at the time of these various supposed poisonings. We know that Artaxerxes' death came at the worst time for the empire. The empire needed Artaxerxes' strength and his ambition if it was to survive what was to come. Arses took the throne upon his father's death, and we know based on varied sources that Bagoas likely did have some involvement, and that if he didn't do the poisoning, he certainly had a vested interest in the outcome of that death. Bagoas had likely also murdered many of Arses' siblings and likely hoped to control Arses upon the throne, to use him as a puppet. Upon taking the throne, the events were already beginning to spin at a pace that Arses could not have anticipated. He was approached by proxies of Philip II of Macedon, who demanded compensation from Arses for Artaxerxes III's assisting the town of Perinthus. Arses declined Philip, who then set an expedition of 10,000 Macedonian soldiers into Asia Minor in 336 BCE. This was occurring while Arses was also aware and trying to free himself from Bagoas' influence on him. He attempted to use Bagoas, his own personal MO of poisoning, but he failed miserably, and Bagoas returned the favor and instead poisoned him and most of his family. Bagoas then played a major role in placing a cousin of Arses, Artashata, on the throne. He was a champion in individual combat under Artaxerxes III's campaign against the Caduci, where he was known as Codomanus. What he was not, however, was a trained leader of men or armies, and certainly not of empires. As with Arses, he immediately sought to distance himself from the influence of Bagoas upon taking the throne. He also adopted the royal name Darius III after his ascension. Bagoas, as he had done so many times before with the other Shahs, sought to remove Darius via poisoning. However, while Darius was naive to the ways of empire, he was not naive to individual politics or power plays. He was able to not only prevent Bagoas's poisoning attempt on him, but to then force Bagoas to drink the poison himself. This left Darius III on the throne by himself. As stated, he lacked all the traits of previous Shahs, and he was effectively rudderless and oarless on a throne that was quickly about to enter Whitewater Rapids. The empire of Darius quickly began to suffer under his ineptitude. The corruption, which had experienced a resurgence after the death of Artaxerxes III, was by now rampant, with each satrap looking after his own best interests. The Greek city-states, meanwhile, had increasingly turned towards Philip II and his promise to free the Persian grip on them and their lands. He had formed the League of Corinth, and the members shared an oath of mutual protection amongst themselves. The force of 10,000 Macedonians that Philip had sent to Asia to free Greeks living there from Achaemenid influence. They won several successes, but then Philip was assassinated in October of 336 at Ægae, the ancient Macedonian capital. Pausanias of Orestis, the captain of his personal guard, was found to be the culprit, and during a marriage celebration of Philip's daughter by his fourth wife, he successfully killed Philip and tried to escape, but Philip's bodyguards caught him and immediately killed him. At the death of their king, Macedon mourned, but even as they mourned, his son, Alexander, would quickly pick up the mantle of leadership. When he was in his young teens, Alexander had led armies on his father's behalf. One such expedition was into southern Thrace to subdue revolts there. Alexander was said to even have saved his father's life during one such expedition. But upon his father's assassination at the young age of 20, he was proclaimed king of Macedon, on the very same grounds of the celebration of marriage, while his father's body had not yet even turned fully cold. 336 BCE was the pivotal year that would signal cataclysmic change in the known world of both the Greeks and the Persians. Alexander, taking a page from the Persian Shahs, began his rule by purging those who could challenge his claim. He would kill all rivals, including his cousin, the former Amyntas IV, whom he had executed. Thebes, Athens, Thessaly, and many Thracian tribes north of Macedon revolted after news of Philip's death, but Alexander wasted no time in mustering 3,000 Macedonian cavalry and heading south towards Thessaly. He prompted their surrender and had their forces join his, and continued his way south towards the Peloponnese, stopping only once he got to Thermopylae. Athens sued for peace. The others quickly followed. Alexander, using his father's style of troop formation and the Macedonian phalanx that he had been instrumental in creating, to full effect. At the Battle of the Carts against the Thracians in 335 BCE, he managed to rout them in their entirety. In the spring of 334, Alexander, now confirmed as hegemon by the League of Corinth as his father was, invaded Asia Minor at the head of an army comprised of both Macedonian and Greek soldiers. This action would mark the beginning of the wars of Alexander. Meanwhile, in Persia, it's been surmised that Darius faced the familiar action of satrapy revolt in where else but Egypt. In addition, there was a pretender on the throne of Babylon, long part of the Persian Empire. And Darius, who had received no training or tutoring to run an empire and certainly had no natural inclinations, likely felt extremely uneasy with all these events happening near the borders with Greece and Asia Minor. Darius's extreme mistrust of the current ruling elite, even the few who supported him, did the empire no favors. Alexander's army entered into Asia Minor and came to a stop at the river Granicus. It was a much smaller Persian army, and one that had leaders of not only differing strategic opinions, but ones with no real track record of fighting battles on this scale that were there to meet him. The exception was the Greek mercenary leader Memnon, who strongly urged the Persians to not fight a direct face-to-face battle with Alexander and his troops. Instead, he suggested they scorch the lands around Alexander, deprive him of food to sustain his mobile army. His tactics, while sound, were ignored as the satraps present wanted no part in destroying portions of their own lands. This, most scholars agree, was the pivotal battle that would decide the empire's fate. Memnon had been loyal to the Persians for most of his life. Being a military general, he knew Greek tactics better than anyone then in service to the empire. More importantly, he knew Alexander and his father better than anyone in the empire. He had been exiled for a time and fled to Macedon, where he met Philip II and a then young Alexander. It was stated that they had many lengthy conversations, Alexander showing interest in Persian tactics, and Memnon in turn able to get accurate measure of Philip as a leader and tactician, as well as Macedon's overall military capabilities. Before his death, it even sought to ally with Greek city-states like Athens, who had been preparing for possible revolt. As with Henry VII in England, Alexander benefited arguably more from his enemies' missteps than his military strategy, sound as it was. The Persians, in not unifying and following Memnon's lead, put their self-interests ahead of the empire. The Persian Empire was an empire built and sustained through cooperation. They didn't know it yet, but they were effectively handing it over to Alexander. It was Alexander who made the first move, sending one of his generals, Nicanor, and his cavalry, along with some Hypaspists, to attack the extreme left of the Persian line. As the Persian left flank weakened, Alexander called on the entirety of his right flank beyond Nicanor to concentrate on this now weakened portion of the Persian left. The Macedonians hit the Persians with such force they were forced back towards higher, elevated grounds beside them. Unfortunately, this put them out of range of the Greek phalanx. Instead, they fell in behind Nicanor's cavalry. Alexander, who was already extremely visible with the colorful plumage of his helmet, was now in the fray, pushing his sarissas into the Persian troops. He would break several, having them quickly replaced after each break. The Persian commanders, who were nearby on seeing Alexander so close and relatively unprotected, attempted to attack him directly several times, at one time coming up directly behind him. It was only the quick reaction of one of his leaders, Cletus the Black, who saved him. The Persians continued to fall back, and Alexander had his troops continue to push the Persians away from the shore of the river. After a short time, they were successful, and they broke through the Persian line near its center. Many Persians were killed as the Greeks continued their push, and many Persians fled. Soon, the Greek mercenaries supporting the Persians would be surrounded by their fellow countrymen under Alexander's control. Mercenary rules under the League of Corinth for these traitors was clear. Any Greek soldiers supporting enemy armies were viewed as traitors. And after a short battle, most were killed, and the rest shipped off to work labor in the Macedonian mines of their homeland's mountains. 2 years into their labor, Alexander, responding to the pleas of Athenian and other Greek city-state citizens, would end up freeing them. With the battle now won, Persia's western border lay ripped open before the Macedonian king. And Darius, now fully aware of the Greek victory, likely understood the urgency needed, as he was quick to build an army in 334 and early 333, with which he hoped to meet Alexander and defeat him. Alexander had the Persian capital of Sardis surrender shortly after his victory. He was able to deplete its treasury and continue south along the lands near the Ionian coast. As city after city fell, he would grant them autonomy within the framework of the lands he was expanding. The mountainous terrain of Lycia was next for Alexander's army, and then all the coastal cities of the south to better deprive the Persians of any landing spots. By the spring of 333, he had crossed the Taurus into Cilicia, but quickly fell ill. After a rest of several months, he began the march towards present-day Syria. This time, Darius was personally leading the Persian troops, and morale was likely high as he had managed to flank Alexander from the rear and cut off his vital supply line. Alexander, on hearing of Darius and his army, turned back towards Darius. The two sides would meet near the town of Issus. Darius, at the behest of his advisors, who felt victory was inevitable, massed his troops on the small adjoining coastal plain. Darius, as like many previous Shahs, would once again fight the Greeks on terrain that favored the Greek enemy and mitigated the effectiveness of the fearsome Persian cavalry. And this ends the first part of the finale. So this is part 8. Part 2 of the finale, which is part 9, will be up next. For over 2 centuries, the Persian Empire had stretched across 3 continents. Where it existed and went, it brought with it the benefits of a vast trading network, a large set of laws that protected not only its citizens, but those who visited and became part of the empire. This also extended to its citizens who practiced various religions like Judaism. They were able to practice those religions without fearing persecution. Cyrus had founded the empire by conquering what was left of the Median, Lydian, and Neo-Babylonian empires. The empire had faced widespread corruptions and insurrection multiple times, as well as multiple incursion attempts, and yet, throughout it all, the empire stood united. However, all empires have a zenith, followed by a period of decline before joining other empires in the annals of history. In our last episode, Darius and Alexander neared each other's armies near the area of present-day southwestern Turkey. Alexander had been marching along the coastline to capture as many coastal settlements, towns, and cities as he could, with the strategy of depriving Darius and his Persian fleet a landing spot. Darius, meanwhile, discovered he had effectively been shadowing Alexander and cutting off his supply line. Alexander, while in Tarsus, heard Darius was massing in Babylon, and he reasoned correctly that if Darius was to reach the city of Issus, he could receive the support of the Persian fleet there. So he quickly began moving southward from Gordium through the Sicilian gates to Issus. And here, at the port, Alexander would set up camp. He left wounded and sick troops at the camp to recover, and he headed southwards toward a narrow plain located between the Mediterranean Sea and the Amanus Mountains. Darius selected a northern route to advance. The Persians then recaptured Issus, and upon finding Alexander's wounded men there, promptly cut off all their hands so that none of them could pick up weapons against the Persians in the future. There's speculation about how each army moved and massed prior to the battle at Issus. Even numbers of troops on either side is disputed in the various accounts. Those estimates for the Persian army ranging from 250,000 to as high as 600,000, but revised modern estimates instead put that number conservatively at between 25,000 and 108,000 maximum. The Macedonian side, historically and recently, has been set at roughly 40,000. The Greek account states that Darius had entertained the notion of waiting for Alexander at Issus, but instead hoped to separate him from that base. Alexander marched south towards Syria, but on hearing of Darius in Issus, turned back. Here is where most agree Darius made perhaps his biggest tactical blunders. Both strategies he had entertained could have been executed successfully. However, Darius would move even further south, reaching a narrow strip of land which would see his troops fighting yet again at a disadvantage. During every empire's existence, there are brief moments capable of great change and upheaval. This battle was such a moment. Persia's very existence, its very survival, hung in the balance. It has been recorded in the same Greek sources that the weather on this day was cold and that it rained incessantly. While the thin strip of land bisected by a river would prove disadvantageous to Darius, it would prove a benefit for Alexander mobility-wise. Darius had formed his line with heavy cavalry troops concentrated nearest to the coast to his right, and a contingent of Greek mercenary phalanx, as well as his Persian infantry, to his left. He himself, as was customary for the Persians, was at its center. The sources say that placement was not Darius's only tactical mistake. He was said to have been offered a strategy by his general, Charidemus. The strategy? To split troops and allow Charidemus to first engage Alexander with half of the troops. We'll never know whether it was pride or ego, or neither or both, that saw Darius decline this strategy. We know simply that it was not executed. Charidemus was said to have uttered some words of contempt in Greek under his breath at his offer being declined. Darius, who spoke Greek well and understood what was said, had his general promptly executed, unfortunately, before the battle, where he would offer no assistance. Alexander, for his part, had spread his troops much thinner, owing to his smaller numbers. He stretched them to compensate across the length of the river in an attempt to match Darius in length, but not in depth. Darius sent his cavalry in against Parmenion, who was able to hold them at bay long enough for Alexander to make a calculated strike with his own companion cavalry. At first, it didn't go well for Alexander, as the cavalry had to not just cross the river, but the defenses on its northern bank. Many of his best cavalry officers and men were killed. However, Alexander's men knew precisely when to feign retreat and re-entrench themselves in alternating cycles, all in an effort to buy additional time. Here was Alexander's moment. 200 years of Persian history set to be run through in an instant. Alexander at this point was on foot, and he led the charge across the river, punching a hole directly through the Persian line, just as his right flank, which was held by Agrianians, drove back a large group of Persian skirmishers. Once through, Alexander mounted and immediately gathered his most trusted men and charged directly at Darius and his group of royal bodyguards. The Greek account states that Darius turned and fled, leaving his men to continue trying to hold the areas not punched through by the Greeks. Alexander, ever the tactician, realized that his center and left flank were stressed, and instead of continuing his pursuit of Darius, turned back and punched another hole, this time into the Persian Greek mercenaries from their rear. This caused the mercenaries to break up and also flee. Word had now spread that Darius had fled the battlefield, and his remaining troops abandoned their positions in a full all-out rout. After the battle, the sources say Darius had fled so fast that his own family of daughters, wife, and in-laws were left behind and promptly captured. Alexander moved along the Mediterranean coast, capturing cities along the way south. He passed through Jerusalem and Egypt, both of which welcomed him and his troops. There in Egypt, he would make plans for his future city of Alexandria along the coast, but all the while he planned for his next encounter with Darius. He had planned to march to Babylon, but on hearing Darius was at Gaugamela instead, opted to go there. He knew that a decisive battle would be necessary to finally end Darius, and by extension, the empire would be his. Darius had learned a valuable lesson in his first engagement with Alexander, and thus chose this setting of Gaugamela, where he hoped to control the variables in his favor, starting with the clearing of a large area of battlefield. Alexander's center was composed of highly skilled and disciplined phalanx infantry. Hypaspists on each side of center supported them in turn. His flanks manned by cavalry units, Thessalonians on his left and companion cavalry on his right. His smaller second rank was held by Thracian and Illyrian infantry. As in the previous battle at Issus, overall command would fall to Alexander on the right, followed by Parmenion on the left flank. In an attempt to ensure he had the flank advantage with his lower troop count, Alexander stretched his right flank beyond the cleared ground Darius had prepared for battle. Seeing this, Darius matched Alexander by stretching his lines and then sending in his left flank to prevent Alexander from overstretching any further. To do this, he sent in his left cavalry to attack Alexander's far right. The two sides collided again and again, with the Macedonians gaining the upper hand and even causing some of the Persian cavalry to flee. Darius, upon seeing the Macedonians gaining the upper hand on his left, then sent in his chariots, who propelled forward toward the Macedonian center at breakneck speeds, only to be sidestepped by the waiting Macedonian infantry. As the chariots rode straight through with their tremendous momentum, the Macedonian javelineers and infantry closed in and made short work of them. Then Mazaeus on the Persian left flank charged in with his cavalry towards Parmenion. The Persians hit the Macedonians with thunderous force, forcing them to give up previous ground. Parmenion was outnumbered, and as the fight went on, was beginning to become slowly enveloped by Mazaeus and his cavalry, who were slowly attempting to flank. Parmenion's men, however, were not prepared to surrender or be routed, and they entrenched themselves as firmly as they could to withstand the repeated onslaught of Mazaeus' troops. However, many of his men were lost in the process. Darius then spotted what he believed was a weakness in the Macedonian formation. With Alexander and Parmenion both engaged on their flanks, the center looked ripe for the picking. Darius could not resist this open invitation, and he sent forth his immortal units. However, this was the move Alexander had been anticipating. As Darius's immortals cleared the lines, he and his remaining troops were left exposed, and Alexander, not wishing to repeat the previous battle, sought to charge in and this time dispatch Darius. He and his companion cavalry charged towards Darius, kicking up a large cloud of dust. Upon seeing Alexander bearing down upon them, many of Darius's men, now devoid of immortals to bolster their morale, broke rank and were routed. Darius, in a repeat of his tactics at Issus, saw this and decided to abandon the battlefield yet again. What Darius may not have realized is how close his right flank had been to dealing a decisive blow to Parmenion, and then possibly joining the immortals at the center. Either way, he chose to flee, and at first Alexander gave chase. However, realizing that Parmenion and the center needed him, he turned back to assist. Many of the remaining troops, upon seeing Darius flee, now began to abandon the battlefield themselves, and the rout was on. The Macedonians slaughtered all remaining enemy Persians and Greeks on the battlefield. Even with Darius gone, Persia was effectively his. However, this time Darius's escape would not be successful. His own general Bessus ended up killing him and ended 2 centuries of King of Kings rule. Upon hearing of this, Alexander was furious. He had Bessus captured, and he would be executed the following year. The once cohesive and vast Persian Empire was effectively Alexander's. One of the main reasons we are lacking Persian accounts of this mighty empire is due to the destruction levied by the Macedonians. Persepolis, the bejeweled and majestic ceremonial capital of the empire, was razed so thoroughly that it would not ever rise again. Libraries, architecture, art, all trampled underfoot and destroyed for all time. Countless volumes of Persian history, much like the destruction of the great library of Alexander's namesake in Egypt, lost to us forever. It's an important thing to note, because what survives is mostly the Greek account. And while this is not about taking sides, it is about bias, and no effective counterweight exists for much of the empire's history to balance events. Again, because they were mostly Greek accounts. Alexander's new empire would not last long. After some initial success in India, he would be forced to return west by a combination of his own troops and priests. He would also not live long, succumbing to what most believe was malaria at the still young age of 33. He left no official instructions for succession, and the empire would be splintered among his generals. A new empire would arise on Persian soil that was very different, as it was now a Hellenistic-led empire, the fragments of what was Alexander's. This empire would be called the Seleucid Empire, and it would last for 200 years, but for much of its existence, it would get smaller and smaller as a new empire, consisting of Iranian people again, called the Parthian Empire, would begin to swallow it up. By 125 BCE, all that remained of Alexander's legacy empire was a small footprint of land. Well, thanks everyone. This ends the series. I hope to continue with a new Persian series, this one dealing with the Parthian Empire, so look for that in the future. Guys, really appreciate your viewership throughout this series, as always, and until the next video, cheers.